Sure, I can take the first one as
All
when they
righty.
come up.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Wayne Jennings, and I want to personally welcome you to our forum discussion today. The title of our forum today is Politics and Polling, What Went Wrong? Our Shaker Heights Unitarian congregation organizes these forums for several reasons: as a congregational service to the community, to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us. We appreciate your joining us. I'd now like to introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Chris Rivnak, and he will introduce the topic and our speaker. Chris?
Thank you, Wayne. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming. As a member of our forum committee, I'm pleased to share this forum with you this morning. I wish we could have the forum in person, but that's not possible. One thing we can deliver today is a good discussion on the many issues concerning polling results and how that matters in our lives and the elections. And I also like to thank our sponsor today, which is the League of Women Voters. They did co-sponsor the forum. In last year's election, Biden's margin of victory was half what it had been predicted. Polling samples are based on income, race, age, or education, and they pose challenges, as does the survey methodology. We're going to learn about demographics, sampling size, timing, and other issues, and all of these things affect the accuracy of the surveys. Much of our democracy depends on our ability to measure and understand citizen opinions on all the political issues that currently affect us. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Tom Sutton from Baldwin Wallace University. And his background is that he's from Kent State as a graduate studies. And he's also the director of the Community Research Institute at Baldwin Wallace. But before I turn it over to our speaker, I have a few housekeeping notes. At 10 o'clock, we'll open the discussion to questions and answers. As you listen to Dr. Sutton, feel free to click on the Q&A button. It's likely located at the bottom of your screen. So I'll now turn this discussion over to you, Tom. We welcome your comments this morning.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction, and it's great to be with all of you. Today, we're going to be talking about polling in politics, what went wrong. And as Chris indicated in the introduction, we had quite a variance between what the polling was showing in terms of Joe Biden and how he was doing in the race against President Trump going into the November 3rd elections and the actual results of those elections. Generally speaking, Biden's margins were not nearly as big as the polling suggested in many states. And in fact, Ohio is probably the worst case of misprediction, if you will, where the Biden margin was shown as a slight lead of 1 to 2%. And in fact, we know in hindsight that Trump won Ohio by 8 points. So what I'm going to do this morning is to try to explain why this is. This will include looking at two polls that were done by the Community Research Institute, the Great Lakes poll that we did for Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. We did 4 during the 2020 cycle, 2 of which were in the general election in September and October. We'll also look at the aggregate polling that was compiled by 538.com, which is really probably the best aggregator, and how that compared to the actual results of the vote. And then ask the question, why? What happened and why? And that's going to require a little bit of an exploration into how surveys are done, methodologies, and for those of you that are math phobic, please don't get nervous, but we are going to do a little bit with statistics. You need to understand at least something about that to understand then how polling works and how you can wind up with these differences between what is seen in a survey result and the actual results of the vote. We'll then go on to talk about some of the reasons why we think the surveys were off, what's being done to try to improve that, but always keeping in mind that this is at best an imperfect science, because unlike our dear colleagues in the natural sciences, the most difficult, complex, fickle, and unpredictable phenomena in the universe to predict and to understand are human beings. So with that, let's take a look. So I'm going to start with looking at the results of the polling. This is basically data taken from Swing state polling averages, again, that aggregated data that I was talking about before from the 538.com source, for Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then the other three big swing states that got a lot of attention, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. So you'll see from June to August, there's some pretty significant shifts. And of course, as you see, lots of Bs with the exception of Georgia, with B being for Biden, T for Trump. And these are essentially the margins between the two candidates. So very close in Ohio, Biden a 0.1% margin, Trump then a 0.5% margin, and it kind of goes back and forth until we actually get to the results of the election you see here in the vote margin tally. So let's just jump right over to the November 2nd. This is the final vote tallies, I'm sorry, the final polling averages the day before the election, what we had right up until the day before the election, that Monday, and then the actual result of the vote on Tuesday. Ohio is the biggest discrepancy, as you see, 0.8% in favor of Trump. And of course, he won the state by 8 points. So that's a 7.2% split. And then you see smaller splits. Of course, the next biggest was the national. If we look overall, 4.4% was what Biden won by. And then you see much closer, Michigan, we thought Biden was going to win by 8 points, and he won it by 2.8 points. Pennsylvania, 4.7, he won by 1.2. Wisconsin, look at this, 8.4% points was going to be the Biden margin, according to the polls, and he barely squeaked by at 0.6. And then the other would be Georgia, much closer, which is not surprising because Georgia had been a reliably red state voting for Republican candidates, and Biden barely squeaked by. And as we know in hindsight, again, of course, Georgia went through 1, 2, 3 recounts to verify that vote. These last two columns also give you some information that also helps to tell us a little bit about why polls were off relative to the actual vote turnout. First of all, the change in the vote margin compared to the 2016 election, all the way down the line with the exception of Nevada, you see that the Democratic vote improved by these various percentages. 0.1% in Ohio, even though Trump took Ohio by roughly the same that he did in 2016. 3.3% in Michigan, and you can see on down 5.4% difference in Georgia, which of course is part of what explains why Georgia eventually did get counted as a state that went for Joe Biden. And then this is probably the most important column of this entire table, and that is the increase in the raw vote compared to 2016. We had record turnout. Not since 1908 have we had this high a turnout in a presidential election. Overall, for the country, 16.8% increase in votes compared to 2016, and then very significant increases in these three swing states, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, and still significant, but a little bit lower in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio. And let's remember that with the exception of Nevada, all of these states had voted in favor of Trump in 2016. And all of these states this year, of course, with the exception of Ohio, voted for Trump, both in 16 and in 20. So let's get a little bit into, so that's sort of the states that we're looking at. And we're going to move on to talking about a little bit about the background on statistics that are used in survey research, how survey research works, and then come back to this looking specifically at the Great Lakes poll in comparison to these others that I've introduced. So first of all, as my introductory statistics students learn quickly, you first have to define who's your population. It's not just people, it's a specific group. And typically with political polling, you want a population that's going to tell you the best about what's going to happen about voting, which means you really want to get people who are more than likely to vote. They're registered to vote, they're likely voters based on various questions they answered. Did they vote in the past? Do they say that they're going to vote in this election, et cetera? A sample is a subset of that population. Clearly, for cost and time reasons, it is impossible to survey every single person in the country to find out what they think. The only thing we do related to that is the census, which because of the Constitution's writing language requires, according to the Supreme Court, every single person literally be counted. But in every other way, we use subsets or samples to get the parameters of what we think will happen in a population. There's two types of sampling, probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability is based on the statistical probability a sample will represent a population. Non-probability sampling means that each population member does not have an equal chance of being included. So non-probability would be, I'm going to talk to 6 of my friends and find out what they think about the elections, and then I'm going to say, this is what everybody at Baldwin Wallace University thinks. That's non-probability. Probability would be if I take the whole population of Baldwin Wallace University, students, faculty, staff, and I take samples, particularly if I take it from each of those 3 groups that are randomized, so each person has an equal chance of being in that sample, that would be considered a probability sample. 2 other concepts to understand: confidence interval, which is the degree of confidence a sample represents a population. This is usually set at 95%. So we know that we can't be 100% confident. There's always a chance that a sample completely misrepresents a population. So at 95%, we think there's 95% chance that the degree of confidence is that the sample represents the population. And then the next concept, margin of error. A sample will always involve some level of error. The moment you go what we call n-1, or the population minus 1 or more people, meaning that's your sample, there's always going to be some possibility for error in the specific responses, say, to a survey. The sample size increase, and the general rule is the larger your sample size, the lower your margin of error. That decreases. Typically, a reliable margin of error is between 3 and 4%. So this is the really scary slide, and I'll go through it fairly quickly, but if you are math-oriented or have done survey work, you'll be familiar with this. This is called the normal distribution curve, and it's important to understand because this is basically when data of any kind is distributed what we call normally across the set of values from the lowest to the highest. A normal distribution basically means that the 3 measures of central tendency, mean, median, and mode, all line up along this X line. That's the X for the mean, median, and mode. And it means that's the highest concentration of your values. The number of values of each of the values then starts to decrease as you move away from the mean, median, mode. And again, those all line up. It creates this shape of a bell curve. Now here's the magic. The magic is that it doesn't matter how many values you have, you will still get the same pattern if the data is normally distributed. So this curve could represent 100 values, 1,000 values, 1,000,000 values, 1,000,000,000,000 values. It doesn't matter. So long as they are distributed according to this kind of spread, normal distribution, you'll get the same results in terms of being able to predict where a value might be on that curve based on its actual value, and then controlling it to fit the curve with what we call a z-score. And the z-score essentially standardizes all the different values and puts them somewhere on that curve. Now, the other thing that I'll point out is you see the 95% of values right here in the center. That is where we typically place survey reliability when it comes to that confidence interval, which means that 95% of the values of this bell curve lie within approximately 2 standard deviations of the central of the mean. Okay, so you see standard deviation to the negative, to the positive, and roughly, it's not exact, but it's close. 95% of the values fall within this area here between 2 standard deviations either side of the mean. Below this, you see the actual statistical formula that's used to determine a sample size. I won't go through this in detail, but you see essentially it constitutes the z-score squared times the standard deviation times 1 minus the standard deviation divided by the margin of error. So whatever your margin of error you want, 2%, 3%, 4%, you just plug that in, you square it, you do the rest of the formula, and that gives you what your sample size needs to be. In general, for a sample size for a, say a margin of error of 4%, a sample size should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 500. For a 3% margin of error, it needs to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 900, sometimes even 1,000. But what also happens is that as you move up, excuse me, there's actually a leveling or a sort of a diminishing returns. where in fact the margin of error to try to get it down to 2%, your sample size increases dramatically. Sometimes it needs to go up to like 3,000, 4,000. And after that, now you're getting to the point where you simply just survey the entire population, every single individual. So this is why we typically look at a margin of error of 3, 3.5%, 4% to be safe when it comes to being within a reasonable arena of error to look at whatever it is that we're trying to learn from that population through a survey. Okay, moving on, types of sampling. So how do we sample these populations in political polling specifically? So for probability sampling that I mentioned before, where you're trying to give every single person in the population an equal chance of being selected. The first is random digit dialing, where you have a computerized dialing system of phones for phone surveys, and it just randomly calls those numbers. It's an old system. We have found it is not really as reliable because you get a lot of dead numbers, non-working numbers, and of course there's the perennial problem of people not answering their phones. Then we go to phone lists. You get a sample from existing phone lists. This is increasingly important because of cell phones as well as landlines. What we typically do is try to get a percentage of landlines and a percentage of cells. Now the standard is pretty much 70% cell numbers, 30% landlines, because more and more people are using cells and fewer are using landlines. Voter lists, if you're really looking to get people who are likely voters, the best way to get that is to go to the Board of Election and download those lists of active voters. This is a challenge though, because that information typically does not have or has outdated phone numbers. So then you have to match the voter list with phone lists. It gets to be kind of expensive, but it is one way that many surveys are done, particularly by some of the bigger entities like Gallup, University of Chicago, et cetera. The last part is stratification. So stratification is where you look at specific demographics that you want to get represented. Age, gender, region of a state, that sort of thing. And you make sure that you get a percentage of people in your survey for each of those demographics that represents the actual numbers for that state, usually based on census numbers. The other part is non-probability sampling. One of these, and this is the one that we use, is opt-in respondent panels. So increasingly, because of issues of cost and timing, a lot of survey centers are moving towards what we call non-probability sampling, which basically means you're not going to get everyone having an equal chance of being selected. But by the same token, what you really want are people who represent the demographics that you're looking for to get a representative sample in a survey. The other part of this is recognizing that fewer and fewer people are actually answering surveys. So the idea of just dialing randomly, calling people, we're now down to about a 2% response rate. When we started doing survey work 15 years ago, we would typically, hand dialing phones, our students would complete somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 surveys per hour. That is now down to 1 survey every hour and a half. Obviously that costs more. And the question is, who's answering those phones? In the 15 years we've been doing this, we've seen this consistent pattern. It's for whatever reason that we tend to see that the most likely respondent is older, white, female, well-educated. And so that clearly doesn't represent the entire population. And so then you have to use other methods to try to get that to be corrected. Website-based surveys are notoriously unreliable, but if you're a radio station that wants to know what its listeners think about what they're playing or want to play a game show or whatever it happens to be, it works fine for them. It doesn't work for political polling. And then there are quota-based samples, which is a version of stratification. But again, if it's non-probability, it means that you are selecting who gets to be in the survey as opposed to them selecting themselves. The important part of sampling is determining the parameters. So what's your source of respondents? Phone lists, voter lists, web panels. You have to make your choice. What demographics do you want represented? And you see listed here all the demographics, and this was mentioned earlier in the introduction. Some of these are more germane than others. Gender, age, education are probably the 3, and type of community and political affiliation are the most important. Sometimes you don't want to use that political affiliation because it changes. Sometimes people vote independent. That tends to be the largest group. Or they switch. They're registered Democrats, but for whatever reason, they've decided to vote for a Republican this year. Household income is tricky, partly because we only get about half the respondents giving us that information in the first place. It tends to be rather private for folks. They really don't want to reveal that information. And always, 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 you have to keep in mind this issue of cost and timing. The surveys that we do, which I'll explain in a moment, are based in part on the cost factor and timing. When you see one of the big surveys like Quinnipiac or Marist or Siena, any one of those surveys, which are all done by phone, have anywhere from a 400 to 500 station call center doing that calling, usually with a sample of about 1,500, gathered over 3 or 4 nights at a cost of about $30,000 to $40,000 for one survey. So for the BW Community Research Institute Great Lakes poll, we use web-based panel respondents provided by the Qualtrics organization. It's a large company that also provides our survey platform. We set quotas for age, gender, and types of metropolitan regions, urban, suburban, and rural, using these as our baselines for those quotas. Typically census data, also this Center for Health Statistics information. We screened the respondents to be likely voters. Are they registered, and what was their likelihood of voting this year? The raw data collected in those surveys was then weighted by gender, education, race, ethnicity, and annual household income to represent proportions for each state's population. Weighting is how you correct the inaccuracies that might occur because your raw data doesn't accurately represent a state or whatever your population is that you're surveying. For us, the sample size targets are roughly 1,000 for the 3 states of Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and 800 for Wisconsin, which is a smaller state. And these are our typical margin of errors between 3.3% and 3.7%. I would also note where you see the plus minus, that basically means that whenever you have a result, so let's say the result is Joe Biden 50%, Donald Trump 47%. To be accurate in reading that result, you have to add and subtract the margin of error from each of those results, which basically means that in that case, where it looks like Joe Biden's ahead by 3 points, in a typical survey showing that result, we would call that a dead heat, because that margin of error means that the results could actually be 3 points higher or lower for each of those candidates. And it's also part of why we run into the situation of saying that the survey said so-and-so was going to win by 3 or 4 points, and they either only won by 1 or 2 points or maybe even lost. This is the reason why. It has to do with the margin of error. Unfortunately, it's not something that's very well understood by the media or by people who look at surveys. They tend to just look at the results, but it is a crucial, crucial measure to understand and incorporate into looking at survey results. Okay, a lot of data here, and I'm just going to pick up the highlights, but this is essentially a comparison of the 2 surveys that were done by the CRI, the Great Lakes polls, from September and October. And you'll see that, for instance, if we look at Ohio, we had Biden up by 0.6%. The national aggregate was Trump up by 1.5%. Trump basically, and so the difference was that we were missing it by negative 0.9. Our 4th survey that was done in October, we had Trump up by 1.5%. The national aggregate had Biden up by 0.8%. And so the difference there was Trump negative 2.3. Let's just go straight over to the last 3 columns, because this is really where the most useful information is. The vote results. So you see here for the 4 states, Trump 8, Biden 2.8, Biden 1.2, Biden 0.6.
I'm not going to tell.
The difference in our poll between the result and the Great Lakes poll was negative 6.5. Totally off, but we were lower than the national aggregate.
Think of all the people who had stuff.
4.4 versus 5.5, 3.3 versus 5.8, 5.8, 6.4. Now, we were more accurate than the national aggregate, but quite frankly, it's kind of like saying, well, we both failed the test, but I got a 58% and he got a 52%. But the bottom line is we both failed, right? And that's essentially what happened to our poll and pretty much to every other poll that was taken. The only one that seemed to get the Trump predictions right were the Seltzer poll in Iowa, which was taken literally 4 days before the election. And in Iowa, the predictions for Iowa were right on target. That's also considered one of the most reliable polls in the country. Okay. All right, so now let's get to why. Why the discrepancy between the polls and the vote results? So number one, there's a significant increase in voter turnout. 23 million more of us voted this year in 2020 than voted in 2016, a 16.8% increase. If you'll remember, when I talked about the modeling for likely voters, it's all based on the past. Are you now registered? Do you think you're going to vote? But also, did you vote before? A lot of those models include, did you vote in 2018? Did you vote in 2016? If you didn't, you don't get included unless you're of a certain young age where you might be a first-time voter. That has a huge effect on the likelihood that you're going to be reliable in what you're getting in your sample. Second, the inaccuracy of likely voter models. One factor that is really hard to measure is enthusiasm. But anecdotally, what we did see, particularly here in Ohio, was that the enthusiasm factor for Trump voters was much higher than it was for Biden voters. Biden voters voted for Biden because they didn't want Trump, because they liked a moderate, because, well, he's not Bernie, but he's also not Trump. That's not exactly enthusiasm. Trump voters were hardcore enthusiasts. They wanted Trump, as we saw throughout the campaign, in the election, and obviously after the election. Third, challenge of reaching inconsistent, infrequent voters who are more favorable to Trump. 16.8% increase, 23 million people. These are the number of people who did not vote in 2016. Now, some of those may have been regular voters who skipped 2016, but they also were first-time voters, younger people who jumped into the voting block because they hadn't voted in years but decided this election was different. They really wanted to vote. You throw a big chance factor into the mix of surveying when you add 23 million people that didn't exist, that didn't vote 4 years ago. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. We know from polling, looking back, Democrats, because of the polarization, the politicization of health practices related to the pandemic, Democrats were more likely to stay home than Republicans, and therefore more likely to answer those surveys. And so that's going to have an effect on your outcomes. Second, the effects of increased use of early voting and mailed ballots. These things can't be considered, or if they can be, it's really hard to do. We've never really had this situation before. How do you factor those into how you handle a survey? We may know more going forward, but at this point, we really didn't know how to factor those in. And it was also very time specific. And then finally, these explanations by Emily Eakins of the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank. So this is not bleeding heart liberals. These are conservative/libertarian think tank, had really interesting analysis that the partisan non-response, the lower likelihood of Republican or Trump supporting respondents to answer surveys, she lists as her hypotheses. We don't have the evidence yet. But number one, this aligns with a lack of trust in institutions and society. That if this is an issue, we're going to see a lack of trust also in polling. Second, for those who were college graduates who lean Republican or supported Trump, fear of professional sanctions and therefore self-censoring. In both of these, there's the issue of we can say your data is being kept confidential and will never be revealed. That is always the case with survey data. But as we know, in many different instances, people don't trust, they don't believe, and therefore they say, I'm not telling you anything. Third, and this is one that I've not seen anywhere else, and it makes great sense. Most polls are sponsored by media organizations and or academic institutions. Those align with what have we been hearing for the last 4 years? Fake media and liberal academics. If you're a Trump supporter, that's what you've been fed, that's what you've been thinking and feeling and hearing and believing. You're not going to answer a poll that comes from NBC Ipsos or NBC Marist or NPR and Siena or wherever it happens to be. The larger issue, of course, is the one that means this is not about just Trump and the last 4 years. It is that we are in the middle of an uncivil war. And quite frankly, this goes all the way back, I would suggest, 50 years. The beginnings of significant distrust in American institutions, particularly political institutions, goes all the way back to Vietnam, the protests, Watergate, et cetera. And then we saw the growing change with conservatives coming into power in 1980 with Reagan. And then we saw the slash and burn tactics, political tactics of people like Lee Atwater in 1988 running the George H.W. Bush campaign. And of course, the most famous or infamous Newt Gingrich and his engineering that led to the 94 election results that put the House back in power of the Republicans, first time since 1954. And quite frankly, folks, we may despise those tactics, but in politics, if the tactic works, you use it because it's all about the wins, all about the wins. So I want to just finish with sharing some information from the Pew Research Center. This is a report they just issued on the 2020 election poll errors and what they tell us about the accuracy of issue polling. So this shows you how a slight change can have a huge effect. This was a hypothetical model that they put together, if you look on the left side of the slide, that if you take 1,000 respondents, so if you look to the one on the right basically shows a modeling of the actual results of the election. So Biden wins by 4.4 points. You've got 51.3% of the 1,000 that are for Biden, 46.9 for Trump, and then there's about roughly 1.8% that voted for third-party candidates. If you take 38, just 38 of those Trump voters and make them Biden voters, that margin changes from 4.4 to 12. That tells you why the polling was wrong. 38 out of 1,000, that's all it took to shift this by a margin of 7.6 points. So if it only takes 38 voters switching or respondents switching or not being captured, then you can see from this modeling that Pew did, and Pew, I have a lot of respect for their work. This tells you a lot about what happened with polling and why we saw the results being so different from the actual voting results. Now, what Pew went on to do, I've got a couple more slides on this and then we'll go into questions, is that they actually showed that, well, if this is the factor for the win-loss kind of polling, the horse race polling about who's winning and losing, what effect does this have actually on polling on issues? Does this also mean that issue polling is way off as well? What Pew found is that it actually does not have that much of a difference. So on the right side, we see using the same balanced version, which is the one on the right, from here to the tilted version, which is the more skewed, that there actually wasn't that much difference. If you looked at Trump job approval ratings, a difference of 2 points. Disapprove, difference of 3 points. If we jump down to trust in government, a difference of 1 point. No difference only some of the time. If we go down here to how much more difficult, if at all, is it to be a Black person? And again, these are all questions that were asked by Pew. We see the results here, 2 point difference, 1 point difference, 2 point difference, not much at all, okay? So even though we're looking at one that is very biased based on the distortion, the results on the issues were not that different. Another example here, also from the same study, a large overstatement of voter support for Biden has a minimal effect on measures of opinion about issues. So in the tilted sample, this is the restatement of the model, right? 12-point difference, 4-point difference. But then when we take these issues, newcomers from other countries threaten traditional customs and values versus strengthen American society, There's a 26-point difference in the tilted sample, only a 22-point difference in the balanced sample, a 4-point difference. And below, a 3-point difference in the answers to the question about, is it the federal government's responsibility to make sure all have health coverage? And by the way, interestingly, we see 36, 63, 65, 35. You're going to see on the next slide how this is done based on partisanship. There's actually a significant number of Republicans who think it is the government's responsibility to do something about healthcare. Overall, survey answers did not change comparing balanced and tilted versions. So 113 answer categories had no difference at all. 55, 1 point, 27, 2 points. Only 3 of the questions had 3-point differences or more. So again, this is just evidence that shows that issue polling is in fact a lot more accurate in terms of what people say they think about different issues compared to what we saw in who they said they were going to vote for. And then this is the last one that is again from the same study. Candidate issues divide as expected on issues, but some do not. So this is on the left side, voters. This is non-voters. So it's the same questions on both, but you'll see here favor smaller government. If you took all voters, they're split 49-49. Not surprisingly, big difference when it comes to Biden voters versus Trump voters. Trump voters overwhelmingly favoring smaller government, 81% versus 23% for Biden voters. Then we'll go down here to, again, the question about immigration, threatens traditional American culture, strengthens American society. 61-37 said it strengthens versus threatens. For Biden voters, 85-13, but get this number, 31-66. Now, clearly a majority of Trump voters thought it threatens American culture, but 31% of those voters think it strengthens American society. So this issue is more nuanced than one might think, related to the coverage about issues of immigration and voters' opinions. Federal government responsibility to take health care. Again, I'm going to jump over to the third column, the Trump. 24% of those Trump voters said it is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure all Americans have health care coverage. So one of the other things that's a takeaway for this to me, and one that none of us really think about that much, but we need to, if we're going to do something about polarization, is that not all people who voted for Trump for the same reason. Same thing with Biden voters, but more in particular, you see more variance in the Trump voters on their issue stands than you do here for the Biden voters. So we need to move away from the demonization and move towards understanding the nuances in why people choose to vote for particular candidates versus others. There's a lot more variation when it comes to opinions among non-voters, and a lot of those non-voters became voters this year, and that had an effect again on polling. Just very briefly, and we'll go to questions. We see Republican-leaning Republican favoring smaller government or bigger government, much closer than what we saw over here among the Trump voters, 55-43. Then jumping down about newcomers coming to society, again, much closer, 52-47 versus 66-31. And then finally, responsibility of the federal government to make sure all Americans have health care coverage. People who identify as Republican, leaning Republican, a majority said it is the federal government's responsibility to make sure Americans have health care coverage. A majority, 55% versus the 24% who said the same, who were Trump voters. So understanding those differences between people who voted and who don't, non-voters who jumped into a race like this one and decided to vote, these are all things that have huge effects on survey research and are all contributing factors as to why, at least on the appearances, we might have gotten it wrong. So with that, I'm open to questions and discussion.
Well, Tom, thank you for an excellent presentation. I know that I speak for others when I say that we all learned some valuable information about surveys and political polls. It's now time for questions and answers. Again, please look for the Q&A button on your screen and type in your questions there. Also, if your question is chosen, we'll recognize you by your first name unless you have hit the anonymous button. While we're talking about computer buttons, I also want to mention that there is a chat box button. If you have not already on our forum list and want to receive an email reminder of future forums, please publish your name and email address in the chat box. I will now turn over the Q&A session to Laura and Cliff, members of our forum committee and co-chairs for our Q&A session. They will choose the questions or comments that you've typed in via the Q&A button. Cliff?
Why are election polls needed? Why is it apparently not enough to await the conclusion, counting, and official certifications of the actual voting polls?
Why are they needed? Well, whether they're needed or not, they are part of everything from our desire for information to the protection of First Amendment freedoms. And so it's not something you can stop. And as with a lot related to the media, entertainment, news coverage, et cetera, polls are sort of the same thing. If people ignored them, didn't pay attention to them, didn't want to know about them, the coverage would start to decline and probably cease. But as I have learned, political polling for the media and in turn the public is like throwing chum to sharks. They instantly bite it, they don't pay a lot of attention to its accuracy, and they always want more.
Okay. Typically, textbook instructions on polling procedures are at odds with the true or real environment in which polls are conducted. For example, how do differing survey methods, in-person interviews, online, opt-in, robocalling, et cetera, produce differing results in terms of data quality and accuracy? How and when do methods matter?
Methods matter all the time, but you have to consider the context. And again, the basic contexts are time and money. In our case, we found the Qualtrics panels to be, when done properly using the right demographic sampling and quotas, we thought it was a reliable method. It's a new and emerging method that has increasingly been endorsed by and used by various survey centers, and the American Association of Public Opinion Research has accepted it as a legitimate method. And it's a lot cheaper than running a phone center, as I mentioned. The polls that we did cost us roughly $4,000 per poll. If we had done those same polls by phone, using the technology of auto dialing when you can, and you can't auto dial cell phones, they have to be hand dialed, paying people to make those calls, et cetera, that $4,000 would jump to probably $30,000 to $35,000. So, so that's a major factor. Timing. When you're doing political polling, particularly in a campaign, time is of the essence. You can't run a poll for 2 or 3 weeks and then have the results be reliable. So increasingly, we're seeing larger sample sizes, shorter time frames, 2, 3, 4 nights. And when it comes to all these others, like the robocalling, that's basically a very cheap way of doing phone polling. It can only be done with landlines, which is highly suspect because fewer and fewer of us have landlines. But Emerson College uses this, and they use other methods to supplement that. They use social media data, et cetera, and it actually seems to work. They actually have pretty highly accurate results. I haven't figured out quite why, but it does seem to work for them. The other one that has become widespread, we're seeing it, it's a daily poll now, or at least it was during the campaigns, is Morning Consult. Now, Morning Consult is an opt-in web survey. They basically do business marketing research, but they have tens of thousands of people that respond, and they use the sheer volume of responses to get fairly accurate results. However, keep in mind, this is not randomized sampling. This is just people responding to polls, but because of incentives that they offer, et cetera, they get large responses, they have the money to do this, and as a result, their polls are considered to be at least fairly accurate in terms of what they're predicting. But there are anomalies, and every poll, no matter what methods it's used, carries some risk.
Tom, I have several questions that are related for you from the people watching today. So the first one, they're all related, I think, to the recent election, national election. The first one is, are there shy Trump voters? who don't tell posters their true intention. I'm going to ask a couple of more that are related and then listen to your response. So how often do people change their minds after they're polled? Do people deliberately mislead poll takers, which I think is different from being shy? And then Michael asks, if polls are not to be trusted due to margin of error, what good are they?
Well, I'll start with the shy Trump voter. There were some studies done during the elections about this concept of the shy Trump voter. It's hard to say because on the one hand, there's that hypothesis I mentioned that because of distrust in institutions, particularly the media, combined with, I haven't mentioned it, but it's perennial and we all know it, and it's the desire to not receive unwanted spam calls. We get them on our cell numbers, we get them on our landlines. Companies routinely violate FCC rules with spamming, particularly on cell phones, and yet they don't get punished, so they keep doing it. And so we just don't answer a number that we don't recognize. That will include possibly a lot of people who may be potential likely Trump voters. Add to that what I'd mentioned about the distrust of institutions, the media, academic institutions that are involved with polling, and that just compounds that lower likelihood of answering. By the same token, though, Trump voters have made it abundantly clear that they're quite proud to be Trump voters and that they're very vocal about being Trump voters, but that's in the context of a polarized society where they express themselves when they believe they are among their brethren, in the same way that liberals and Democratic voters feel the same way. This is an American thing, not a political thing. And so if you live in Lakewood, you are happy to put up your Biden signs, and you've got to be really brave to put up your Trump signs, or in Shaker Heights, places like that. You go to Strongsville or anywhere in the rural belt around Cleveland, and you're going to see Trump signs everywhere, or you did. So I think that's a part of it. When it comes to the larger issue really is about likelihood of people answering polls. This concept that people deliberately lie, there's really been nothing found to validate that. There aren't many studies on it, but at the same token, just thinking about a typical person when they choose to answer a poll, do they want to mess with it? Maybe that happens sometimes, particularly if you lived in New Hampshire in the months leading up to the first primary, or in Iowa, and you got your 20th poll call and you said, all right, screw it, I'm just going to give them all the opposite answers for what I think. That does happen, and I know examples of that have happened in both states. It's more likely there than in a general election. Why pay attention to polls at all? Well, you can ignore them, and I would suggest that whenever you are in a close election, which is pretty typical in the last few elections that we've had, the polls are going to be less able to give you an accurate result. And at the end of the day, do you determine who you're going to vote for? Two decisions. Are you going to vote? Who are you going to vote for? To what degree should anyone make those decisions on the basis of polling data? Theoretically, none of that should matter, right? Sometimes it does make an effect. So if we see people saying, oh, well, this candidate's got such a lead, I guess I'll vote for him or her because I don't want to vote for a loser. That does tend to happen in primaries. When you've got 15, 20 candidates running for president, and your candidate's Michael Bennet, and Michael Bennett's a great guy and you really like him, but he's polling at 0.5% compared to all the other candidates, you start thinking, maybe I should go with someone else. Kind of like what it used to be a Browns fan, right? You love the team, but you never bet on them. Until this year, of course, right? So I think the more important part about polls is looking at how people feel about the issues and how those issues then align with the positions that candidates take. Public opinion is important to measure and to use because it is one of the fundamental ways that we learn what the public thinks about issues that we then expect our elected officials to do something about. And a good example of that is what's happened with the $1.9 trillion COVID-19 package that just passed the House and the Senate and now goes to reconciliation in the House. while Republicans did not vote for it on either side, a majority, 70% in the latest poll that was done by YouGov, showed support, including, I think it was 35 or 40% of those who identified as Republican supporting the package. Now, why are the Republicans as office holders not supporting it? That's a different discussion. But knowing that data is important for those office holders to be thinking about how are they going to vote.
Yeah, this is an interesting question from Jean. How did your students react to the results of the 2020 election and the polling that took place?
We actually had students involved in this polling project. So we had a group of students who helped design the questions, analyze the results, and met weekly, twice a week to discuss the process as it unfolded. We had them looking at other surveys, comparing them to our own, and also looking at all the news coverage that BW was able to get as a result of the polling. And as I mentioned, the media loves this stuff. And so they were fascinated. They loved it. They were fascinated by how things turned out relative to the polling. They asked good questions about that. I'm not sure we've turned anybody into a future pollster. Hint, hint, the opening slide with the unemployment line. However, I think in that specific case, they were very enthusiastic about what they experienced. The campus itself, there was concern about a repeat of 2016 in reverse, that if Biden won, the campus probably was going to be okay with it, because our sense was that overwhelmingly the campus was pro-Biden, or at least in favor of a Democrat. There were some preparations made in case Trump had won, because we had to deal with that 4 years ago, and there were a lot of reactions that were pretty negative about it and that affected students personally. We made those preparations this time, and we basically had one forum to talk about the election results. About 30 students showed up at it on a Zoom session, and that was pretty much all that we did. Now, I would also add, I'm the advisor for both our college Republicans and college Democrats. And our college Republicans had a meeting the other night. There were only about 6 that showed up, which is typical. They talked about how they felt very much like what I talked about before, the sense of being censored, the sense of being outcast, or not being able to talk about what they think and feel politically with their classmates and with other students on campus. They feel like they are the, if you will, the minority politically, very much the minority. Pew shows upwards of 75, 80% of Gen Z favoring Democrats and liberal causes, and they're an anchor of the progressive movement. So if you are a 21-year-old Trump supporter or Republican, you don't feel very comfortable on a college campus. And BW is a pretty moderate campus by, at least by campus standards. So it's a mix, I would say. That's just what I've seen so far.
That sort of relates to what you said when you were speaking earlier about the demonization, that really doesn't serve a good purpose.
Absolutely. And again, this is where, and again, polling data that Pew does. Pew, I would recommend for anyone that is not familiar with them, probably the most reliable and broad-ranging surveys are done by the Pew Research Center, because it's not just about politics. They do demographics and issues and social issues, all kinds of things. They're really a wealth of information, and they're very good in their methodologies. And they were very concerned about this question of, if polling was off politically, what does that do for issue polling? Because that's what they do primarily. But they show, they've done polling on this issue of polarization. And one of the questions they ask is, do you think a person who supports the other party or the candidates of the other party, they phrase it like that person has bad character? The percentages have been increasing, and it's over 50% today compared to 30 years ago. Do you think that the country will go fundamentally in the wrong direction, like in a very dramatic fashion, if the other party gains control of government? Those numbers now are up in the 70% range plus on both sides. Both sides see the other in the same way. This is what the polarization is producing. And until we start to really listen to each other and recognize There's a lot more nuances than we give the other side credit for. I have a good friend, Nikki Antonio, state senator, who has been working diligently across the aisle to get Republican support on some very difficult issues for Republicans to support. Two of them being gay rights and ending capital punishment, as well as the abortion issue. Many of her colleagues were quite surprised to hear her talk about how she believes fundamentally that reproductive rights should be protected legally, but that personally, that's not her same position on the issue of abortion. As a human being, she feels differently about it than she does as a legislator. Many of us are in the same boat when it comes to these hot button issues. So I think that's where we need to spend less time characterizing and demonizing, pull ourselves away from those sources that do that. Social media being part of that. MSNBC and Fox are probably the two prime characters when it comes to cable news, cable shows that promote this sort of thing, and then the more extreme versions of that on the right side. The best way to not be influenced by that stuff is to just not watch it. So I would say that that's some of the things that we need to start doing, and keep in mind that the person in front of you who you think represents everything that you disagree with is still a person and needs to be seen that way.
Well said.
All right, Tom, got a question here. From Eileen, why did Trump have an 8-point margin in Ohio, especially when the densely populated cities and increasingly their suburbs are all, I'm pretty sure of this, Dems?
Great question. This is largely due to the, I would suggest, two factors. Trump had very high enthusiasm among his voters and among those that were thinking about voting for him in the largely rural areas of the state. He made increases also in several of the urban areas. If you look at a voting map of Cleveland proper, you actually see little red shadings all across the southern part of Cleveland from west side to south to the east side. Because for some voters, voting for Trump meant voting for that low unemployment rate and gradually rising wages that we saw before COVID. It represented the Amazon entitlement center or Amazon fulfillment centers that opened up on the east side where people were getting jobs at $10 or $12 an hour that they didn't have before. For many voters, that's a basic function of whether they vote and who they vote for. They don't really care whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. If you deliver the goods economically, you're going to get my support. The other factor was the lack of Biden's campaign taking Ohio seriously, and combined with the fact that we have a relatively very weak Ohio Democratic Party structure. This state is dominated by Republicans as much because of weak Democratic networking, resources, recruitment of candidates, et cetera, as it is because of the strength of rural voters voting for Republicans. The demographics still show a Democrat can win in this state. Sherrod Brown is a good example of that. But a Democrat can't win in this state the same way they can in New York or California. They've got to win more on issues that affect people who live in rural areas. They've got to win more on the basis of issues that transcend racial, ethnic, and gender lines, issues of jobs, issues of education. They can't be talking about spending money constantly about these things. Quite frankly, the most liberal politician outside of Sherrod Brown in Ohio today, just based on stands on issues, with a couple of exceptions, is Mike Dewine. Because if you look at his budget, you look at his spending, you look at what he's trying to do, he looks a lot like a moderate Democrat. He didn't look that way 20 years ago. So there is room for a Democrat to win in Ohio, but if you don't have a ground game, you don't have organizing, and none of that happened in 2020 in Ohio, then you're going to see Republican candidates win by large margins, including Trump. We need our version of a Stacey Abrams, because believe me, if a Democrat, not one, but three, including their first Jewish senator, first Black senator, winning, as well as Biden winning, in a state that was solidly Republican, it's because of two things. It's a rapidly growing state because of the Atlanta metro area, and the ground game that was organized by Stacey Abrams and associates. Ohio needs the same thing if Ohio wants to see Democrats get elected again.
Since folks with higher levels of education like to participate in surveys and self-identify as Democrats, can polls then overrepresent Democrats? Do weights help? And how do they help?
Good question. It is tricky to choose and or weight respondents by political affiliation. Again, because you have many who might lean one way or the other, but are consider themselves independents. Probably the most reliable way of getting at this is to look at positions on issues and then try to weight based on the positions of issues on issues relative to who they then choose to vote for. That tends to be very consistent, but at least in our methodology, we shy away from this idea of do quotas for people who self-identify as Republican, Democrat, Independent. It's again, because it's a rapidly shifting phenomena, particularly when you get into that issue of infrequent voters, first-time voters, et cetera.
Okay. Is Gallup as effective in predicting accurate election outcomes as they used to be, or not?
Yes and no, because they really don't do political polling anymore. Gallup got out of the business 8 years ago. They have done some sort of retrospective polling on politics, but they've really stayed away from being one of the primary providers of political polling. Of the private companies that do it, Harris, Rasmussen, Ipsos are probably the three that you see more of. Rasmussen is seen as one that kind of leans Republican. Really, the majority of the polls that you're seeing now are the ones that are based at universities and are partnered with major media outlets.
What impacts do statistical adjustments called weighting have on accuracy of polls? Are weights often disclosed? How can you discern for arbitrary weighting?
Weighting should never be arbitrary because then you're essentially manipulating the data, and anytime a poll is manipulating the data, it's unethical. What the 538.com does in their aggregating of polls is that they look very carefully at the methodologies that are used, and they will mark a poll on their site either as unreliable or that there are questions about its methods. In terms of the methodology of weighting, it can be very useful provided you have a sufficient number of respondents in that particular demographic subcategory that the weighting doesn't distort the results. So one of the famous examples from 2016 was a poll that was done, I believe it was done in California, and they drilled down to a subset that was voters ages 18 to 29 who were Black males. The number of respondents who fit that category in that poll was 4. And 2 of them favored Republicans. Now, typically in the race category, Black voters are the only demographic that has the highest likelihood of voting in one way or another, and that would be towards Democratic candidates. The results of the election compared to that poll were wildly off because their sample was too small that they were then using to weight. So the key is that you can only go so far down in your demographic subsets to do weighting. So that's typically why gender, because it's roughly a 50-50 split. Race, ethnicity gets trickier when you're doing that kind of thing. And so when we did it, we only did it for, I believe we had white, Black, and other. Because of the 4 states that we were doing, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, all of those, particularly the Pennsylvania, not so much, but the other 3 states for sure, the quote other, which would be your Asian American, Hispanic, mixed race, et cetera, is, according to the census, it's anywhere from total 3 to 5% of the state's population. That's really small. So we conflated those together. Now, if we were doing a poll that was looking specifically at Latino voters, it'd be completely different in the way that we structured it, what our sample size would be, et cetera. So, so I think that's where the weighting part, it's useful, it's necessary sometimes, but you have to be very careful about how you go about doing it.
A couple of minutes ago, you were talking about the difference in preferences in, let's say, Cuyahoga County and some of the counties around Cuyahoga County. So I'm saying that context for the question that's being asked by one of our participants. Do you get more response from rural or urban voters in polling?
Typically, the response rates are the fastest and highest in suburban voters. Next would be urban, and the last would be rural, and that's why we use the quota system. So what we actually did was to create quotas for the urban and suburban first and filled those, and then the rest was rural. So with those quotas being set based on the percentage of each state's population that lived in what were considered urban and suburban areas, by doing it that way, the rural we knew was going to be well represented according to their proportion to the state's population. And I think it also explains why our results, while still off, were a little bit closer to the actual results of the vote compared to the national aggregate of polls, because we were one of the only polling organizations that actually did that kind of specific quota sampling. We're probably going to adjust that again. We may leave our surveys in the field longer to make sure that we're capturing not just rural, but specific regions of a state. So for instance, Ohio, the region that is always the most difficult for us to get responses from is Southeast Ohio, sort of that Appalachian area. Very reluctant to respond to surveys. And we may have to do some other tactics as well. I'm not quite sure what, but that's key, because if your sample's not right, nothing else is.
Here's a couple of questions that are somewhat related from our audience today. And after I ask these, Chris will have the last couple questions. So one of the questions is from Michael, and it's, what kind of polling techniques might we see in the future? What are your students going to invent in terms of polling techniques, or yourself? And the other one, it's also a little bit looking at the future. If you had $1,000, if you had thousands of dollars, how would you spend it to improve accuracy in surveys and polls?
The ultimate gold standard for polling is where you have a randomized system of selecting respondents to ensure that you get all of those representative demographic categories, that they are chosen based on randomized, the way I described earlier, where you have randomized phone lists, that sort of thing. But then that they agree to be part of a survey, part of a set of surveys. So it's combining randomization with the development of panels. KnowledgeWorks is one organization that does this. They're part of GfK, which is a huge market research company based in Germany. They are the gold standard, and it costs a lot of gold to get any poll from them. So I would love to use their panels, because then I know I would be getting complete representation, and I'd be getting accurate results because these people have agreed in advance and are compensated, which doesn't influence the results, but it does commit them. That, I think, is really going to be the future of hopefully more accurate polling. The problem, of course, is, again, you're talking about issues of cost. So we'll see.
Thank you. Chris, I think we're back to you. And you're on mute. Chris, you're on mute.
I'm back. I was waiting for your last question. All right. Well, closing remarks then. I want to thank Tom for his excellent forum today on survey research and polling, a very important topic which we'll be hearing more about given the upcoming local primaries in May. We truly appreciate your experience, expertise, and commitment to being here with us this morning. Some announcements. Next Sunday's 9:30 forum will be entitled Small Businesses, Chronicling the Effects of COVID-19. The pandemic has really affected our local businesses. Many have closed. We need to know how they can survive in the coming months and post-pandemic world. Speakers will include Bob Rosenbaum, Head of Market Development for the Heights Observer publication, Katie Van Dyke, Director of CSU Small Business Development Center, and Melissa Hirsch, owner of the Unbar Cafe in Shaker Heights. This forum today has been recorded and it will be soon be available on our Unitarian website, uucleveland.org. Look for the recording of today's forum starting tomorrow in the large forum square of the website. I also want to mention the chat box function. If you are not already on our forum list and want to receive an email reminder of future forums, please give us your name and email address in the chat box button on your screen. We also like to invite you all to attend our virtual Unitarian service at 11 o'clock today here online. So to participate in that, you would go to uucleveland.org. Click on the green box in the upper right-hand side of the website. The YouTube link will take you directly to the 11 o'clock service. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you next Sunday at 9:30 for our forum on small businesses. Good day.